Hi friends, welcome to Beautifully Bookish Bethany. Today's video is something a little bit different. My patrons for this month wanted me to read and vlog Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. This is a nonfiction book that is part nature writing, part thinking about indigenous stories and how it applies to our relationships with the earth as humanity, among other things. And it's the sort of thing that I had been recommended to read a little bit at a time instead of all at once. So what I'm going to be doing this month is every day I'm going to read one chapter and then I'm going to reflect on my thoughts on that chapter. I've read the first one for today and we'll do this throughout the month. I do feel like this will end up being kind of a long video, so I may split it into parts. We'll see how it goes. I have to say, so far, the writing is beautiful. People who said this was meditative are absolutely right. The first chapter, I believe, is called Sky Woman Falling, and it tells a creation myth from the author's people and then reflects on it. And one of the things that I found really interesting about this is it talks about how the creation myths we grow up with, even unintentionally, can affect the ways we interact with the natural world and the ways that we think about them. And so the difference between the story of Sky Woman Falling, where she gratefully accepts the gifts of Mother Earth and of the animals, and then also gives in return, and it's this just beautiful, joyful relationship, versus the story of Eve in the Garden of Eden, which is what I grew up with, where she eats the apple and then is cast out and they are told to dominate the earth. And the author even talks about this type of relationship as being abusive. It's really interesting to think about that way, and I'm gonna be pondering it. So yeah, really strong start to it. I'm so interested to see what the rest of the book is gonna hold, and I will check back in tomorrow. Today's reading was The Council of Pecans, and I have to tell you, I have already sent off for my own physical copy of this book. The writing is gorgeous, I love it, and I want to have a copy and be able to read along and tab it. I'm so glad I'm reading this. So The Council of Pecans is fascinating. It gives you all this information about pecan trees, which I had no idea. There's a lot of interesting stuff, but the kind of cool takeaway from it is that pecan trees act in unison for the benefit of the entire grove and are part of this entire ecosystem, and it's kind of drawing parallels to the importance of working together for the community, that flourishing can be for everybody when we work together. Also, it's so interesting, the things that they still don't know and are just starting to learn about how plants can communicate with each other through things like pheromones. It's so fascinating and stuff that I had no idea. So this book is just so good, so thought-provoking, and I am loving it. Today's reading was A Gift of Strawberries, and it has me thinking about the market economy versus the gift economy and the reciprocity that goes with gift giving. And it has me wondering how well I live in that, and how much even in parenting and raising children, teaching the market economy happens from such a young age, and like whether there's a realistic way living where we do in a city the way that we do to reclaim some of that. I don't know. Also, it makes me want wild strawberries because they sound delicious. It's July 4th, and the segment for today was The Offering, shorter than some others, but still really beautiful. I could see this one particularly resonating with Indigenous people who have lost some of their heritage and lost some of their connection to their culture and ceremonies, because it talks about how the heart of a homemade ceremony that isn't perfect can still be the same and can still be powerful, and that it's about saying thank you to the earth, and it's about gratitude and about connection, and I just think that's really beautiful. Goldenrod and Aster is about how science and art work together to help us understand and appreciate nature. That even though when she entered botany, her professor said, well, what you're wanting about beauty isn't part of science, it is and isn't true. That both of them are part of how we see and understand the world. We need all of it. Western knowledge, indigenous knowledge, all of these different things are a part of how we understand the world around us and what we're seeing and why it matters. I'm a day behind, so we're going to do two. Learning the grammar of animacy is this really interesting pondering of language and the way it affects how we think about the earth. The author is trying to learn the language of her people, even though she didn't grow up with it, because very few people are actually fluent speakers. And one thing that's really interesting about, I don't have the book in front of me, Potawatomi, I think is the language, is that it uses a lot more verbs than nouns, and it ascribes animacy to things that are thought of as its in the English language. Things like obey, that there's a verb about to be obey. And she explains it as this idea that the water could choose to do something else. It's choosing to form itself into a bay, but it could just as easily be a river or a stream or something else. And it's so interesting, this idea that if the language we use imbues life in the natural world, that changes the way we think and interact with that world. Maple Sugar Moon connects an indigenous story about why it takes so much sap to create maple syrup with the actual practice of getting sap from a maple tree and cooking it down into syrup, and how what you get from the earth is not enough, and that the effort that humans put in to transform it and to take part in it is part of what it allows it to become sustenance, and the sustenance that was needed at the end of a long winter when supplies would be diminishing and depleted. It's interesting how much detail about different plants and practices there is, things that I just didn't know. Witch Hazel is told by the author's daughter, and it's kind of this beautiful story about this older woman who lived near them when she was a girl named Hazel, who she thought was a witch, and she was also really into plants and formed this friendship with their mom. But she was also a woman who came out of and lived in a lot of poverty, and so it's a reflection on that, but also on the beauty of friendship and relationship and kindness between people, and connecting that to the witch hazel flower, which I didn't realize is these yellow flowers that bloom in November right before winter, which is kind of beautiful. This idea that nature is giving you something beautiful, something hopeful right before you get into the depths of winter. A mother's work is about when she moved into a place with a pond that needed to be renewed to be okay for swimming. And it talks about the ecology of ponds, the various life cycles that exist within a pond, and also this idea of mothering, that there's different versions of mothering within an ecosystem, and also that as a human, being a mother doesn't end when your children grow up and leave the home, but that you then become a mother to your grandchildren, to your community, and to the earth itself. And I think that's beautiful, that there's this cycle of caretaking and nurturing and mothering that doesn't just end at a certain point in life. So hi, it's been a few days. Our whole family got COVID, and so this vlog kind of took a back seat. I am mostly recovered. First day I've put on makeup in a while, and I wanted to share, because this came in the mail, I got my physical copy of Braiding Sweetgrass, and it is beautiful. It has a nice ribbon bookmark. It's got some illustrations in it. I'm so happy to have a physical copy to follow along with. And I will get back to my reading of Braiding Sweetgrass, but this may not all happen in July. You may be seeing this video in early August instead. The Consolation of Water Lilies is about her daughters going off to college for the first time, and both the grief but also the joy of being alone, having your kids out of the house where you miss them, but also being able to take time for yourself and enjoy nature. And it was a short one and beautiful. And then Allegiance to Gratitude is an interesting one because it's about this ritual that they have in a school where they teach her native language, where every morning the kids will say things being grateful to the earth and grateful to people, and it's about like oneness and community and gratefulness, and comparing that to her daughter when she was in 6th grade deciding she didn't want to say the Pledge of Allegiance, and understanding maybe why that would be if it's linked to colonization. And yeah, I don't know, I think it's interesting, the idea of beginning a day with gratitude and thanking the earth. And it's like, I don't know, I think there's a lot in this book about how the things we focus on, the things we spend time thinking about and talking about, and the way we frame our understanding of the world, frame the way that we approach the world around us, it's worth thinking about. Epiphany in the Beans is reflecting on how not only do we love the earth, but the earth loves us back, and seeing the fruit of the earth as a gift, showing love. And I think that's really interesting. She was talking about how a lot of her students, even ecology students, would say they love the earth, but they're really uncomfortable with the idea that maybe the earth could love you back. And why is that? The other one that I listened to was about the three sisters, and this was fascinating. The three sisters are corn, beans, and squash, and the traditional indigenous way of growing them is together. And there's also this sort of mythology around who the three sisters are. But what's interesting about it is that when they're grown together, they support each other, they keep pests away, and they have fewer problems. And it's just really interesting that there's this like communal element to their growth, and that now scientists can understand more about why this works so well and what each of them takes and provides for the others to help them grow better. But it's so different from these Western ideas of having all rows separated into different planting rows, and that's maybe not ideal for growing conditions. Both of the readings for today have some similarities, which is interesting. One is Black Ash Baskets, and the other one is about Teachings of Grass, I think. And Black Ash Baskets is about these people who do traditional basket making, and part of it is about having this relationship with the trees, that it's the symbiotic relationship that removing some of the branches actually helps the trees to grow and flourish, but also that it's about being thankful for and using all of the things that you're taking for the baskets. And then when there are invasive species of bugs caring for the trees, for the ash trees. The Teachings of Grass is interesting because it's following an experiment that she did with a student, looking at sweetgrass and testing whether different kinds of harvesting would make it flourish or not. And surprisingly to typical scientists, they found that regardless of the method of picking, the harvested patches flourished better than the control patches that were not harvested. And so it's this idea that you can take too much from nature, but you can also not take enough, because humans also are part of this ecosystem, which is interesting and not something we always think about. It's also talking about the difference between Western science and traditional science, and how often Western science doesn't want to accept teachings that probably were tested over time and then handed down by ancestors. Really interesting. Maple Nation is interesting because it's about this idea of citizenship and giving back to a community, but also to nature, that like maple trees sort of give back, and people who live in communities with maple trees give back to the maples that give to them. It's again like this concept of reciprocity, but tied in with these ideas of good citizenship in your local community, which is interesting. And then I think the lengthier and more challenging, at least for me, piece is the honorable harvest, which is about these ideas of not taking more than you need, of giving thanks back to the land, of never taking more than half, and also making like the things that you consume, making sure that they're taken in an honorable, ethical, sustainable way. And I think the challenge is, as somebody who lives in a urban center, you know, I don't live in a place where I have that kind of contact with the land. And I think what she's talking about is beautiful, and I respect it. And I know people who live in places where that can be their life. But what do you do when that's not an option? I mean, there are small things like buying organic fruits and vegetables, or pasture-raised meat and eggs if you can afford it. But also that, you know, like, it can be more expensive to do those things, and not everybody is able to. And like, how do we think about the ethics of consumption in urban centers with class differences, with, I don't know, like it's messy, but it's interesting, it's thought-provoking. In the Footsteps of Nanabojo is about a creation myth, and one of the ideas there that I thought was interesting is the idea that the United States, being a nation of immigrants, is full of people who haven't settled, who aren't from here, and that maybe this creation myth of somebody learning how to have roots and be at home and name the plants and animals and creatures could be a direction to take for people who also need to do the same thing here, and that might impact the choices we make in terms of climate policy and other things. In The Sound of Silver Bells, the author recounts a time early in her teaching career in the Bible Belt where she was trying to get pre-med students to understand the value and importance of other parts of the ecosystem and other parts of life beyond just the humans that they'd been studying, and ends up being taken by surprise at what ends up working. That it's less about the facts and the knowledge and more about eliciting wonder at the natural world around you, and that is something that people can reach from a lot of different places and a lot of different perspectives. Putting Down Roots talks about why sweetgrass is disappearing from the areas it's traditionally grown. And it's interesting because it grows well in many places, but it's really increased development that is killing it off. The fact that allows it to not have a sustainable root system. Developing buildings and concrete and all of this is what is causing sweetgrass to slowly die off, and then also connects that with the value of people putting down roots in different places. Umbilicaria, the belly button of the world, is super interesting because it talks about this thing that is like a symbiotic relationship between a fungus and an algae, and it's fascinating because it only happens in harsh environmental circumstances where it's a mechanism for survival, and scientists don't totally understand why or how it works, but it's really interesting. But at the same time, all of these things and many of these plants that she talks about here are sensitive to climate change, and that with climate change or with pollution in the air, you will start to see some of these things dying off, and how important it is that we really care for the world around us. Old Growth Children is about forests, and it follows the experiences of a man who bought some land and tried to regrow a forest, specifically cedars, which are apparently pretty hard to take care of when they're young. They're eaten by a lot of animals, they need a lot of protection, and they've been disappearing for a lot of reasons from different places. And it's just this really interesting discussion of different kinds of trees and plants with berries that are invasive species, and how complex ecosystems are and how they interact. Also, really wild, apparently there's a way of getting planks from old growth trees without killing them, where indigenous people would pound on them and part would come away and leave the rest fine, which I'd never heard of before. So interesting. Witness to the Rain is a meditation on the water cycle of rain and rivers and how plants interact with it as well, including mosses that when it's raining will actually stretch out tendrils. It's pretty amazing. Wendigo Footprints talks about the myth of the Wendigo, which is a human who has become this insatiable cannibalistic monster, and connects it to this idea of insatiable consumption that traditionally was viewed as such a negative thing, but now in late stage capitalism in the world that we live in, we see insatiable consumption being pushed and also continuing to exist in ways that are really harmful through things like addiction, for instance, in addition to just general consumption. It's interesting that the traditional mythology really warns even young children against excessive consumption for fear of being turned into this kind of a monster. The Sacred and the Superfund is maybe the longest piece that I've read so far, and it recounts details of a sacred lake that has gone through years of pollution and talks about what it has done to the lake, to the ecosystems there, to the environment, and suggests this idea, which I think is really interesting, that discussions of environmental problems and knowledge about those things often breeds despair instead of hope and action. And the author suggests the concept of restoration as a better alternative that can combat the despair that can exist when people think about what's happened to the environment. That participating in the restoration of the earth on a local level or at whatever scale you can is part of how you fight against despair and part of how you reconnect and make things better for the future. People of Corn, People of Light is probably among my favorite passages that I've read. There were just so many ideas here that it was exploring. It's talking about an indigenous origin myth. It's interesting because it suggests that the people that the gods ended up making and leaving after trying and failing are people who were respectful and showed humility and engaged in reciprocity, as opposed to the people of light who were arrogant and self-involved. And this idea that we want to be like those people of the corn, which is interesting. Another really striking sentence is she talks about how the breath of animals gives life to plants and the breath of plants gives life to animals, that there is this symbiotic relationship between people and plants in terms of carbon dioxide and oxygen. And I just think that's really beautiful. It is amazing how it works, but what a beautiful way to think about it, that our breath gives life to the other. That really stuck out to me. And then lastly, she talked about science being a lens that brings the world into focus, but blurs spirituality, and that while there is a lot of value to science and things that it can make clear, there are also places where it lacks and where it just can't give us everything. Collateral Damage is a bit of a rougher one. It talks about the life cycle of salamanders and how with increased development in the life cycle of a salamander, once they reach sexual maturity, they return to the lake where they were born for mating. But the problem is that they have to cross roads, and they cross slowly and have very delicate bodies that are easily killed. And so there's a lot of salamanders who get run over by cars during this one season where they're trying to return in order to mate. And she relates it to the war in Iraq, which was ongoing when this was written. And this idea that there's collateral damages that we accept in hopes of protecting future generations, but is that everything we could be doing, or is that what we want to do? And the fact that there's, some level of heartbreak that goes along with it. time for the final 2 readings from Braiding Sweetgrass as we conclude this journey. First was Shkitagan, People of the Seventh Fire. This is about fire making, traditional forms of fire making, and also different kinds of fire. There are sacred fires, there are daily fires that we use for cooking food. There's also fires that are used for controlled burns in the wood that use death to create opportunity for growth. Then the final chapter is called Defeating Wendigo, and this imagines, as we talked about earlier, this wendigo, this overconsumption. What is it that would defeat it? And what I think is really beautiful is that the author's solution is plenty. Is instead of creating this sense of scarcity or this artificial scarcity, which is what capitalism does in markets, of there being plenty, because that's when wendigos don't have power. And I got a little bit teary-eyed at the end with the way that she talks about this. So we have finally come to the end of reading this beautiful book, Braiding Sweetgrass, and I just loved it. I think this has to be on my list of favorite books of the year because it's something that I can see myself returning to over the years more than once. It's something that is so meditative and thought-provoking and just beautifully written. Highly recommend it, and if you have access to the audiobook, which is read by the author herself, her voice is so soothing, and I would recommend that as well. I hope you enjoyed taking this journey along with me, and I would love to hear from you in the comments down below. If you've read Braiding Sweetgrass before, or if this video has made you more interested in picking it up, let me know in the comments, and maybe let me know if there's anything in this video or in the book that you have taken away from it and are thinking about. I definitely have a lot to ponder myself. Subscribe if you want to see more. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.